She only wanted wood for the fire, but instead found a man bleeding into the dirt, whispering a name with his last breath. Saving him would mean choosing between safety and a danger she could not yet see. The prairie stretched wide and empty under the sinking sun, the grass whispering low as the wind carried dust across the ridge. Leah had come there looking for dry wood, her arms tired, her back aching from days of work that never seemed to end. She was used to silence, to the kind of lonely quiet that presses against your chest and makes you wonder if the world has forgotten you. But that evening, she heard something strange carried by the wind. It was not the cry of a hawk or the call of a coyote. It was softer, broken, like a voice that had been dragged through too much pain. She almost turned away, thinking it was just her own imagination, until she saw him. Slumped against the rocks at the edge of the ridge lay a man, a cowboy by his clothes. Though dust and blood had turned the once brown leather dark, his hat had fallen into the dirt, his hair matted to his forehead, and his shirt was soaked through with a deep crimson stain that spread across his ribs. Leah froze, clutching the bundle of wood tighter, her heart hammering in her chest. She had learned the hard way that strangers often brought nothing but danger, yet the sound he made again, a rough groan that cracked into a whisper, pulled her forward before she could stop herself. She dropped the wood and crouched beside him. His lips moved as if trying to form a prayer, but the only word that came clear was a name, one she had never heard before, spoken in a voice so weak it seemed the next breath might be his last. Then his eyes rolled back, and his head fell against her arm, limp and heavy as stone. Leah's throat tightened. She should have left him, should have walked back to her cabin and barred the door, but something in her chest would not allow it. Maybe it was the memory of being left herself once, bleeding and broken, while others turned their faces away. With a grunt, she hooked her hands under his shoulders and dragged him from the rocks. His boots scraped the dirt, his weight near impossible for her thin frame. Yet inch by inch, she pulled him toward the narrow path that led to her cabin. Sweat burned her eyes, her arms screamed, but she did not stop. The prairie grew darker, the sky painted with streaks of fire, and still she moved him forward, her breath ragged, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. When at last the cabin came into sight, small and weathered but standing, Leah nearly collapsed with relief. She shoved the door open with her foot, hauling the man inside, and laying him on the rough bed by the wall. For a moment she stood over him, panting, staring at the blood that would not stop seeping through his shirt. She whispered a curse under her breath, then fetched water and torn linen, her hands trembling as she pressed the cloth to his wound. Helping him would mean risk, maybe worse, but leaving him would mean carrying the weight of his death forever. Leah pressed harder on the wound, her jaw set. Whatever came, she would not let him die alone tonight. The night pressed heavy against the cabin walls, the prairie wind rattling the shutters as if the darkness itself wanted in. Leah knelt by the bed with a lantern burning low, her hands raw from scrubbing and wrapping the wounded cowboy who now lay restless under the thin quilt. His breath came in uneven bursts, sometimes shallow, sometimes ragged, and every time his body jolted, she thought he might slip away. The blood had slowed but not stopped, seeping through the strips of cloth she had tied around his ribs, and the smell of iron mixed with the smoke of the small fire made her stomach turn. She had seen animals die slow deaths after a wolf attack, and the look on his face reminded her of that same fight between life and the pull of the grave. She wrung out another cloth in cool water and wiped his brow, her fingers brushing over skin slick with fever sweat. His eyes fluttered open just once, glassy and wild, and he whispered words broken like glass. She leaned closer, straining to hear. "Don't let them, please." Then he sank back, his jaw clenched, his body twisting as though some unseen hand dragged him through nightmares. Leah felt a shiver run up her spine. Whoever they were, she knew enough of the world to understand danger would follow, and yet her hands did not stop their work. She dabbed the wound again, adjusted the quilt, and kept watch with a stubbornness she could not explain. Hours dragged like years. The fire popped and crackled, shadows leaping across the log walls, and Leah's mind wandered to old fears she had buried long ago. She remembered the faces in town that once turned away from her, the whispers about a woman who did not belong, the cruel laugh of a man who had promised safety but left her with scars no one could see. She knew too well the cost of trusting the wrong person, yet here she was, nursing a stranger who might bring ruin to her doorstep by morning. She could have left him under the ridge, could have let the prairie claim another nameless soul. But each time she thought of it, she saw again the way his lips had shaped that plea. Near midnight his fever broke into a storm. He thrashed and muttered, his voice carrying the sound of battle, of loss, of names she could not catch. She held his shoulders down, whispering softly, though she did not know if he heard. "You're safe. You're not alone. Not tonight." The strength in him frightened her. Even wounded, he nearly tore the bandages loose. But slowly, her words and the damp cloth against his forehead eased him back into a shallow, uneasy rest. When the first pale light crept under the shutters, Leah sat slumped in the chair by the bed, her eyes gritty, her body aching from the long vigil. She looked at the cowboy's face, softer now in the dawn glow. And though she still did not know his name or his story, she knew one thing for certain. She had chosen to fight death for him through the night, and for reasons she could not yet admit, she was glad she had not lost. The sun had only just broken the horizon when the sound reached her, a deep rumble rolling over the prairie, like a storm not of thunder, but of hooves. Leah's hands froze on the wash basin, her heart lurching into her throat. She moved to the window, the pale light spilling across the land, and there they were, 3 riders cutting across the grass, with the kind of certainty that told her they were not men to hesitate. Their horses kicked up dust, their faces set hard in the cold morning air, and even before they drew near, she could see the resemblance, the sharp jaw, and the same lines of stubbornness carved into their expressions that mirrored the face of the man lying wounded in her bed. She barely had time to draw in a breath before they were off their horses and at her door, boots striking the earth with the weight of ownership. The cabin shuddered as one of them shoved the door wide open, and the other 2 crowded in behind him. Leah stepped back, clutching the cloth she had been holding, as if it could shield her from the steel of their eyes. They barely looked at her, their gaze going straight to the bed where the wounded cowboy lay still under the quilt. One of them cursed under his breath, another let out a low whistle, and the tallest of the 3 crossed the room in 2 strides, dropping to one knee beside him. "Cade," he muttered, his hand brushing the fevered man's shoulder. The name struck Leah like a bell, sharp and final. Cade, that was who she had dragged from death's door, who had whispered broken pleas in the night. Now his name was claimed by these men as if it had always belonged to them alone. They turned to her at last, but there was no warmth in their gaze. Gratitude sat cold on their faces, shaped not in thanks, but in suspicion. "You took him in," the tall one said, his tone flat, his eyes scanning the room as though searching for traps or secrets. Leah swallowed and nodded, the words sticking in her throat. She had expected fear, or even relief, but instead she felt like an intruder in her own cabin, as if her very presence there was a crime. The second brother, leaner and sharper, crossed his arms and sneered. "Funny thing, finding him in a stranger's bed. Folks don't just stumble across half-dead men unless they know something." His words hung like smoke, and Leah felt her face flush with a heat that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. She wanted to protest, to shout that she had only kept him alive when the prairie would have claimed him, but the words caught against the old knot of shame that lived in her chest. The third brother, younger but no less hard, leaned against the wall and studied her with eyes that cut. None of them thanked her. None of them offered kindness. And in their silence, she felt the walls of her cabin closing in. Cade stirred faintly then, his lips moving as though to speak her name, though he could not have known it. All 3 turned back to him, their bodies blocking her from view, and Leah stood with her fists clenched at her sides, wondering how saving a man's life could make her feel more alone than before. The brothers did not leave her cabin, though dawn stretched into morning, their heavy boots pacing across her worn floorboards, as if the place belonged to them. Leah stood near the hearth, her arms tight across her chest, watching as they leaned close to one another, their voices low but not so low that she could not catch the edges of their words. "Dangerous," one hissed, his eyes cutting toward her as though she were a snake waiting to strike. "Trouble," another muttered, spitting the word with the same disgust a man might use when finding rot in his meal. The youngest said nothing, but his gaze followed her every move, sharp and unyielding, and she felt the weight of it pressing into her back like the barrel of a rifle. Cade stirred weakly in the bed, his breath shallow but steady, and the sight of him tethered Leah's resolve to the floor. She had pulled him out of the dirt with her own hands, had watched over him through the long dark hours when fever threatened to claim him, and now these men thought to take him away as though he were a sack of grain she had stumbled upon. The tall one, who carried himself like the leader, finally turned to her, his voice clipped and cold. "We'll take him from here. You've done enough." Leah felt something sharp ignite in her chest, something hotter than fear, stronger than the shame that had followed her most of her life. "No," she said, the word trembling but firm. "He stays here until he can stand on his own." The room went still, the fire crackling loud in the silence. All three pairs of eyes pinned her, and for a heartbeat she thought they might strike her down then and there for daring to defy them. The lean one stepped forward, his hand brushing the butt of his revolver, though he did not draw. "You don't get a say, woman. He's our blood, and blood belongs with blood." His sneer deepened, the corners of his mouth twisting. "Or do you fancy keeping him here like some foundling pup?" Leah's hands shook, but she lifted her chin, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I saved him," she said, her voice low but steady, every word anchored by the truth of what she had endured through the night. "If not for me, he would already be buried under the prairie grass, another body for the coyotes. You think you can just ride in and claim him after you left him to bleed out? Not while I still draw breath." The youngest brother shifted uneasily, his eyes flicking to Cade's pale face as if torn between loyalty and doubt. But the older two held their ground, anger burning in their eyes. Leah stood taller, though her knees threatened to buckle, though her palms were damp with sweat. She would not hand Cade over like a broken horse cast to auction, not after she had fought for his life. The brothers could call her dangerous, call her trouble, call her whatever name they wished, but she would not yield, not this time. The day wore on, heavy and tense, the brothers taking turns pacing across the cabin floor, while Leah kept near the bed, her eyes on the man she had fought to keep alive. His breath was easier now, though his skin still held the pale color of someone who had walked too close to death. She changed the bandages with careful hands, feeling the weight of 3 pairs of eyes on her back, each of them sharp with distrust. Every time she dipped the cloth into the basin, she reminded herself that Cade's life still clung by a thread, and that thread was worth more than their contempt. It was near noon when his eyelids began to flutter, his head shifting slightly against the pillow. Leah leaned forward, holding her breath, the basin forgotten at her side. His chest rose in a deeper breath, and then slowly, painfully, he opened his eyes. They were the same steel gray as the men who claimed him, yet softer, clouded with fever but not with suspicion. His gaze found her face, lingered, and in that instant Leah felt something stir that pushed away the fear which had shadowed her since the brothers had stormed in. He tried to speak, his lips parting, a rasp of sound escaping that was more breath than word. She bent closer, urging him not to strain, and pressed water to his mouth. He swallowed with effort, then managed a hoarse whisper. "You kept me alive." It was not a question, not doubt, just quiet recognition. The words, fragile as they were, reached her deeper than any praise she had ever known. Behind her, one of the brothers scoffed, muttering that he was too far gone to see straight. The taller one snapped at her to step back, as though her nearness threatened to poison Cade's recovery. But Cade's hand moved slightly, his fingers brushing against hers with deliberate intent. "Don't," he murmured, his voice breaking. "She stays." The room thickened with silence, the fire popping in the hearth like distant gunfire. Leah sat rigid, torn between shame and defiance, her pulse racing as the brothers exchanged glances heavy with anger. The lean one shook his head, his jaw tight. "You don't know what you're saying, Cade. Fever's got you twisted." Cade turned his head toward them, his effort clear in the strain of his neck, his voice little more than a cracked whisper. "No, she saved me. You weren't there." He coughed hard then, the sound raw, and Leah reached for him, steadying his shoulders until the fit passed. His eyes closed again, drained by the effort, but the truth of what he had said hung in the air. Leah felt their contempt sharpen, as though her presence now was not only unwanted, but a wedge between them and their wounded brother. Yet even as they muttered under their breath, even as their stares tried to strip her of worth, Leah held on to the look Cade had given her. It was the first time in years that anyone had seen her without suspicion, the first time someone's eyes had reflected not judgment, but simple truth. She had saved him, and for that, he would not cast her aside. The wind carried voices easily across the yard, and Leah, stepping out with a bucket in her hand, froze when she heard the brothers speaking near the barn. The horses stamped their hooves restlessly, as if they too could sense the bitterness in the men's words. She stayed close to the cabin wall, the rough logs pressing against her shoulder, her breath caught in her throat. She had no wish to eavesdrop, yet their voices came sharp and clear, and each word pressed into her like the edge of a knife. The tall one spoke first, his tone low but steady, the kind of voice that belonged to a man who expected to be obeyed. He said Cade had been ambushed on the trail 2 days before, cut down without warning, left for dead by men who rode under no flag but carried grudges like coin. They did not know who had paid them, but the suspicion in his words grew heavier as he spoke. He wondered aloud how convenient it was that their brother had ended up in the cabin of a woman alone, far from town, a woman no one knew well and no one trusted. The lean one spat in the dirt, his voice sharper, full of contempt. He said he had heard whispers of her before, of how she had been cast out of the settlement to the north, though he did not know why. Trouble followed certain people, he said, and maybe this woman had drawn Cade into it without him even knowing. His words rolled like stones in Leah's stomach, each one striking against the old hurts she had carried for years. The youngest brother said little, though his silence spoke too. He shifted, cleared his throat, muttered that Cade was too stubborn to fall for tricks, yet even he did not rise to her defense. Leah stood still as stone, her fingers digging into the wooden bucket until her knuckles whitened. She wanted to shout at them, wanted to spill the truth of the long night she had spent fighting to keep Cade alive, wanted to tell them she had bled her hands raw, pulling him back from the edge. But her voice would not come, not when the memory of other voices lingered. Men in the settlement who once called her a liar, women who whispered that she was cursed, children who laughed behind their hands as she walked by with her eyes downcast. She turned slowly, moving back into the cabin before they could see her listening, her chest burning with shame and anger. Inside, Cade lay resting, his face drawn yet calmer than before, and she sat by his side, staring at him, as if the sight of his steady breathing might quiet the storm inside her. Still, the brother's words clung to her, heavy and poisonous, reminding her of every lie that had once driven her from her old life. She had thought she left those whispers behind when she came to the edge of the prairie, but here they were again, wearing new faces, tearing at her like wolves at a carcass. Leah kept silent, but the wound inside her festered, deeper than any knife could cut. The tension in the cabin thickened, until it felt like the walls themselves were pressing inward. Leah had kept quiet through their mutters and stares, through the way they spoke about her as if she were not there at all, But silence only fed their anger. By late afternoon, the lean brother's patience cracked. He pushed off from the wall with a sneer, his boots striking hard across the floor. His hand clamped down on her arm, rough and sure, and he told her plain that she was leaving now, whether by her own will or dragged out into the dust. Leah's heart thudded hard in her chest, but she stood rigid, her face set, though her knees trembled. She opened her mouth to protest, but her voice broke before it could form words. He shoved her toward the door, and the youngest stepped forward as if to help, though his eyes wavered with doubt. The tall one said nothing, only watched, his jaw clenched, his silence more dangerous than shouting. From the bed came a sound that cut through it all, a groan rough with pain but edged with steel. Cade pushed himself upright, his face pale as ash, sweat pouring down his temples. His body shook with the effort, yet he forced himself to sit, one hand pressed hard to his bandaged side. His voice was little more than gravel, broken by weakness, but it carried more weight than any threat. "Stop," he rasped, the words slicing the air. "She stays." The room froze. The lean brother's grip on her arm slackened, his head snapping toward the bed in disbelief. Cade's eyes, clouded with fever yet steady, burned with a kind of strength that even blood loss could not drown. He looked at each of them in turn, his brothers who had ridden hard to find him, and for the first time since they arrived, it was not them holding the ground, but him. Leah stood stunned, the heat of tears pricking behind her eyes, though she fought them back. No one had spoken for her in years. No one had taken her side against the world since before she could remember. The last time she had been cornered like this, no voice rose for her, and the silence had driven her into exile. But now here was Cade, broken and bleeding, yet willing to defy his own kin to keep her where she was. The lean brother cursed under his breath, muttering that Cade was addled, that fever made him blind. The youngest shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flicking between Leah and the man on the bed. The tall one finally moved, slow and deliberate, his eyes narrowing as he weighed the moment. But Cade did not falter. He leaned forward, his voice cracked but clear. "She pulled me back," he said, each word dragged from somewhere deep. "You take me from her, I die." The silence that followed was heavy as stone. Leah felt her breath tremble in her chest, but she held her ground, her arm free now, her place in the cabin no longer hers alone, but something Cade himself had claimed. For the first time in years, she was not cast out but held, and the line had been drawn in the dust. Night settled quiet over the prairie, the kind of quiet that holds its breath between the crack of firewood and the sigh of wind slipping through the shutters. The brothers had bedded down in the barn, their distrust still thick, but kept at bay by Cade's stubborn demand. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low and warm, shadows rising up the log walls, and Leah sat in her worn chair with her hands folded tight in her lap. Cade lay on the bed, propped against the pillow, his face pale, but his eyes more awake than she had seen them since he first opened them that morning. For a while, neither spoke, the silence stretching long, but it did not feel sharp like the brothers' silence. This one was softer, waiting, like soil ready for rain. Cade's voice came at last, rough from pain but clear enough. "Why?" he asked, his gaze fixed on her, though his body trembled with weakness. Leah blinked, caught off guard. "Why, what?" she said, though she knew what he meant. He drew a slow breath, his chest rising uneven beneath the bandages. "Why risk yourself? You could have left me where I fell. No one would have blamed you." His words were not accusing, only searching, like a man trying to piece together a map after being lost too long. Leah's throat tightened, her fingers curling against her skirt. She stared into the fire, watching the flames lick at the blackened wood. "Because I know what it feels like," she said softly, the words tasting like rust. He waited, silent, steady, giving her space to untangle the knots she had kept hidden for years. She drew in a shaky breath and let it spill. "I know what it is to be left behind, to be cast off like nothing worth keeping. I've been the one bleeding in the dirt, while others turned away. I couldn't do it to you. I wouldn't. Her voice cracked, but she did not stop. She told him of the day the town cast her out, of the lies whispered behind her back, of the way no one spoke for her when she needed it most. She did not tell every detail, some wounds too deep for words, but enough that the air between them filled with more than smoke. Cade listened without interruption, his silence not cruel but gentle, his gaze never wavering. When she dared glance at him, expecting pity or judgment, she found neither. His eyes were soft, holding her like a steady hand, not trying to fix her, only seeing her as she was. The fire popped, scattering sparks, and Leah looked away quickly, her cheeks burning with a heat that had nothing to do with the flames. For years she had carried her shame like a stone in her chest, certain it would keep her small forever. But here was a man half broken with fever and pain, and he looked at her as though she were not ruined, but whole. She pressed a hand to her heart, steadying herself, and whispered, "That's why." Cade gave a faint nod, his lips curving in the barest shadow of a smile. "Then I owe you more than breath," he murmured. And in that moment, Leah felt seen for the first time in years. The morning began quiet, the kind of stillness that made every sound stand out sharp against the prairie air. Leah stepped outside with the water bucket, the cool wind brushing her face as the sun crawled up over the ridge. She was tired from the long night by the fire, her eyes still heavy, but something unsettled stirred in her chest. She had learned to trust that feeling, the same instinct that had kept her alive through years of hard solitude. As she crossed the yard, her gaze lifted toward the far hills, and that was when she saw it. Dust rising faint on the horizon, not the easy drift of cattle, but the steady churn of hooves moving fast and with purpose. Her heart kicked against her ribs. She set the bucket down without a sound and squinted, her hand shading her eyes. The figures took shape as the sun sharpened. Riders spread wide, their silhouettes too familiar. She remembered the stories the brothers had muttered about the ambush, remembered the ragged voices Cade had spoken in his fever, and she knew in her bones these were the same men. The ones who had left him for dead were coming back, their trail cutting straight toward her cabin. Leah spun on her heel, skirts brushing the dust, and hurried to the barn where the brothers were tending horses. Her breath came short, but her voice did not falter. "Riders," she said, sharp enough to cut through their muttering. 5, maybe more, coming fast from the ridge. The tall brother straightened at once, his face hardening as he caught the look in her eyes. The lean one cursed under his breath, already reaching for his rifle, while the youngest paled and muttered that maybe it was just travelers. Leah shook her head fiercely. "They're not travelers, they're hunting. I know the look." For a moment, they only stared at her, suspicion still clinging to them, but the urgency in her tone forced them into action. They grabbed rifles, loaded cartridges, checked the saddles. The tall one barked orders, but even he glanced at her again, uneasy, as though unsure whether to trust her word or not. Leah didn't wait for permission. She moved to the cabin, fastening the shutters, pushing the table against the door, her body moving quick and sure. Her hands did not shake. She had seen too many nights of fear to let it master her now. Inside, Cade stirred at the noise, his eyes opening weakly. She knelt by him and whispered, "They're coming, but we'll hold." He tried to rise, but pain gripped him, and she pressed him back gently, her fingers brushing his hand. For a moment his gaze met hers, and in that look she found enough strength to carry her through. By the time the riders reached the lower slope, rifles glinted in the brothers' hands, and Leah stood firm beside the door, clutching the pistol she had kept hidden since her exile. The same men who had called her trouble now depended on her eyes, her instincts, her courage. She would not falter, not when the violence she had always feared had come riding back to their door. The light of dawn had barely touched the horizon when the raiders came down from the ridge, their horses kicking up a storm of dust, their shouts tearing through the still air like war drum. Leah stood at the cabin door with her pistol clutched tight in both hands, her heart hammering yet her grip was steady. The brothers took their places outside, rifles raised, eyes narrowed, and even Cade, pale and weakened, had pushed himself up against the window frame with a revolver resting in his lap. The land that had been so quiet the evening before now shook with the thunder of hooves and the crack of gunfire, and there was no room left for fear. The first shot split the air, sharp and merciless. Leah flinched at the sound but lifted her arm and fired, the recoil jarring her shoulder yet sending one rider tumbling from his saddle. The brothers glanced back in surprise but said nothing, their focus fixed on the wave of men bearing down. Smoke curled from rifle barrels, dust churned up around the horses, and the cries of men echoed across the prairie as the clash began. Leah reloaded quickly, her hands moving with a certainty she hadn't known she carried, each bullet sliding into place as though she had been born for this fight. A rider broke off from the others and charged toward the cabin, his face twisted, his rifle leveled at the door. Leah stepped out from behind the frame, raising her pistol before he could fire. The shot rang out, sharp and clean, and he tumbled to the ground, his horse fleeing into the smoke. Her chest rose and fell with the force of it, but she did not falter. She would not lose the home she had built, no matter how small or lonely it had once felt, not to men who thought they could take without cost. The lean brother shouted for her to cover the left side, and she obeyed without hesitation, moving along the cabin wall, her skirts catching in the dust. Together they held the line, each gunshot echoing in her ears, each moment a blur of fire and smoke. The youngest brother stumbled when a bullet grazed his arm, and Leah was there in an instant, pressing him back toward cover, her voice fierce as she told him to hold steady. His eyes, once cold with suspicion, met hers with something like respect, before he nodded and took his place again. Through it all, Cade's voice carried from the window, hoarse but commanding, his shots slow yet sure, each one driving the raiders back, step by step. His strength was failing, but his will was iron, and Leah felt that iron flow into her. She fired again and again, each shot fueled not by rage, but by something steadier, something that told her she belonged in this fight as much as any of them. When at last the riders pulled away, leaving bodies and dust in their wake, the prairie fell silent again, broken only by the hiss of smoke and the harsh breaths of the living. Leah lowered her pistol, her arms trembling at last, her body slick with sweat and dust. The brothers stood around her, battered but unbroken, and in their eyes was no longer suspicion but the clear light of knowing she had stood with them, not behind them. She looked toward Cade, slumped but alive in the window, and he gave her the smallest nod, one that told her she had proven herself in the dust and smoke of the prairie. Smoke lingered in the air long after the gunfire stopped, curling low across the yard where bodies lay still and the dust had settled into silence. Leah stood with her pistol still clutched in one hand, her arm aching from the weight of it, her ears ringing from the roar of battle. The brothers moved slowly around the cabin, checking the fallen, their clothes streaked with blood and dirt, their faces carved with exhaustion. The lean one wiped his sleeve across his brow, smearing red into the dust on his skin, while the youngest pressed a strip of cloth tight around his grazed arm. The tall one leaned against the fence post, his rifle hanging loose in his grip, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. They looked at her then, and for the first time since they had thundered into her life, their eyes held something other than suspicion. She had stood with them, not behind them, not hidden, but beside them as the raiders bore down. She had fired until her hands were raw, shouted warnings when riders broke through the dust, and pressed her shoulder against the cabin wall as if it were her own blood kin inside. They had seen it, and no words were needed to mark the change. She was no longer the stranger they thought dangerous, no longer the woman they whispered might be tied to their enemies. She had fought for Cade and for them, and the truth of that was written plain across the ground where the raiders lay. Leah's knees threatened to buckle as she stepped back inside the cabin. Cade sat propped at the window, pale and trembling, his revolver still in his lap, his breath coming shallow but steady. His eyes found her the moment she entered, and in them she saw relief deeper than she could bear. She crossed to him, lowering herself to her knees at his side, her hand brushing his. He gave her a weak smile, a faint curve of lips cracked with fever and strain. "You kept me alive," he murmured, his voice breaking into a rasp. "Not just me, them too. We'd all be lying in the dirt if not for you." She shook her head, her throat tightening. "You give me too much credit," she whispered, though the weight of his gaze told her he meant every word. His brothers entered behind her, moving quieter now, their boots softer against the floorboards. The lean one glanced at her, his expression unreadable, before muttering low, "She fought harder than any of us." The youngest gave a small nod, eyes lowered but respectful, and even the tall one, who had spoken most against her, looked at her with a kind of tired acknowledgement. For a long time no one spoke, the fire crackling the only sound. Leah kept her hand on Cade's, her heart still racing, though in the silence she felt something shift. The cabin was no longer just hers, nor was it theirs. It was something shared, bound by the smoke and the blood that had sealed the morning. Cade squeezed her hand weakly, his voice rough but certain. "You are the reason we lived." And for the first time since her exile, Leah let herself believe it. The seasons rolled forward, carrying the memory of that bloody dawn into the quiet rhythm of days that followed. The scars of the fight remained, a bullet hole still marking the frame of the cabin door, blackened patches of soil where smoke had once choked the air, but life had returned to the place with a gentleness Leah had not thought possible. The garden by the porch grew steady under her care, rows of beans climbing the poles, squash spreading wide across the dirt, and corn standing tall enough to catch the breeze. She worked with her sleeves rolled, her hands calloused yet sure, and beside her Cade moved slower than before, but with a strength that returned little by little. His limp kept him cautious, his laughter came with pauses, yet each sound of it was a victory, each smile proof that death had not won. The brothers still came from time to time, riding hard across the prairie to check on Cade and the woman they had once eyed with suspicion. Their voices were softer now, their eyes less sharp, and though they did not always say the words, Leah could feel the shift. The lean one helped mend a fence without complaint, the youngest brought seeds wrapped in cloth, and even the tall one, still stern, nodded to her with a respect that no longer felt begrudged. They did not question her place beside Cade, not anymore. The fight they had shared had carved away doubt, and the land itself seemed to remember who had stood against the raiders when the sun rose red that morning. Leah sometimes caught herself pausing in the middle of a task, her hands stilling as her thoughts wandered back to the years behind her. The long road of exile, the whispers that had followed her, the nights spent alone, with only silence for company. She remembered what it was to carry shame like a brand, to believe that no place in the world would ever be hers again. Now, kneeling in the dirt, with the sun warming her shoulders, and Cade's voice humming low as he whittled by the porch, those memories felt far away, as though they belonged to someone else. One evening, as the sky turned copper and the prairie stretched endless under the fading light, Leah stood at the edge of the garden, her hands resting on the handle of her hoe. She looked at the cabin, its rough logs weathered but strong, smoke rising soft from the chimney. Cade sat on the step, watching her with that steady gaze that had seen her when no one else had, his smile slow and sure. Her chest swelled, her throat tightened, and before she could stop herself, she whispered the word she had buried for so long. Home. The sound of it trembled in the air, fragile and new, yet stronger than any vow she had ever spoken. Cade rose carefully and came to her, his hand warm against hers. He did not need to speak. The land, the cabin, the garden, the bond forged in blood and fire, these were hers now, theirs now. For the first time since being cast out, Leah knew she had found a home worth claiming, and nothing could take it from her. If this story left its mark on you, subscribe, like, and saddle up for more videos.